to use Illustrator. So we're not going into anything in depth here. It's just going to be about showing you about the workspace and getting you familiar with some of the tools. So I've opened Illustrator. What you would normally have to do is maybe log in with like your college email, and then it would bring up this page. Whenever I make a new document, I'm going to go to create new. So I'm not going to pick one of those first options that it gives me here. I'm going to create something that's personal to what I want to do. And when I see this window, I've got lots of options here. So these are personalized sort of presets available to you for whatever it is that you want to make. And it's based on where that piece is going to be used. So you've got to plan in advance what you're making and what you want to use it for. Most of the time, if you're doing posters or anything like that, it's going to be print. And you can see I've got A4, and if I do view all, I've also got A3. So I'll start on A4. Then I've obviously got a file. I can change my file name. I can change it to landscape or portrait. And then I've got my color mode down here. You always want it to say 300 ppi there, so that's the quality that you're designing at. So we always want the highest. And then we've got two options for color mode. So color mode is about the type of color you're using and what you're using it for. So RGB is red, green, blue. Red, green, blue is the LED setting on our screens, on our computer screens. So if you're making something that's going to live on the screen, so a website design, an app design, an animated GIF, anything that's going to live on the computer, then you can work in RGB. If you're doing something that you're going to print out, so for example, I've made an A4 document, so you think that maybe I'd be printing that out at some point, maybe a poster, then it wants to be CMYK. So CMYK is cyan, magenta, yellow, and then K stands for black. So that's what we use in the printers. So those are the inks that are in the printer. If I created a document in RGB and then printed it out, the colours would look wrong because they're calibrated for screen. So when you print them out, they wouldn't print at the right tone, they wouldn't print at the right saturation, they'd look off. So if you're going to print it out, make sure you use CMYK. So I'm going to use CMYK for now. Now, when my document opens, we're going to look at what's called the workspace. So the workspace is just the general area that you're working in. So we have our sort of document up here, our document tab, and we have our toolbar down the left-hand side, and then we have our panels on the right. Now, our panels are where most of the stuff happens, really. We've got other options up here, so different sort of menus up along the top that we'll be looking at as well. First thing I tend to do is I head to this icon on the top right. This icon makes my workspace catered to what I need, so I can change how my workspace is set up. I tend to use essentials. You're only really going to need essentials, but you can see it's got loads of different options. And what can happen sometimes is things can move out, things can disappear, things can get deleted, things can start to look weird. This could be over here like this. So if your workspace doesn't look how it should, or you've got tools missing, or your tools look different for some reason, so they don't look right, then head up to this icon and you can do reset essentials, or you can just make sure that it says essentials, that it's ticked there, and that should reset and reformat your workspace. This white area of the document here is the page, so that's where I'm designing stuff. We call this an artboard in Illustrator, and you'll see on your left hand side you've got an artboard tool. So if I just hover over that icon there, if I select the artboard tool, I can change the size of my artboard. You'll see my properties panel has changed, so I can rename my artboard. I can make it A3, I can make it landscape. So it gives you those options to edit your artboard. So your properties panel on the right hand side here will adjust depending on what tool you're currently using. So that's our artboard. So I could make multiple artboards. Quite often I might draw myself some more artboards. So if I'm doing several designs or several versions, always work on a new artboard. So I'm going to draw that, and then I'm going to make sure it's A4 size. So now I've got two artboards, so I've got two places to put my designs. All of this grey space, if I do Command minus to zoom out, so Command minus on my keyboard, then I can see all this grey space. All of this grey space can be used for spare things, reference imagery. People tend to put sort of like colour palettes and things down here, inspirational imagery, and then they use that to help them with what they're making on their screen. But when they save the document and print it, it only prints what is on the artboard, it only exports what is on the artboard. So Command minus and Command plus to zoom in, that's one of our first sort of shortcuts. The next thing I always do is just work my way through the tools panel, and you can see these ones have got little sort of triangles on. So if I hold down, it opens up another menu, and it gives me those tools that I can sort of see other tools. So I've got a rectangle tool, but I've got other shape tools. I've got a brush tool, but I've got other drawing tools. I've got a text tool, and I've got other types of tools, etc. And you can sort of just hover over these and sort of see what they're called and see what they do. I tend to just, if you've never used it before, I just have a go at placing things and seeing what all of the tools do and what happens with them, and just understanding what those things do and getting to grips with them. So tends to be, first thing you do is just have a little play around and see what happens when you use the different tools. Then if I've done loads of stuff that I don't want, I can do Command Z, which will undo those things. And if I've gone too far, I can do Command Shift and Z, and that will bring those things back. In this case, I'm just going to get rid of everything. So I'm actually just going to drag with my mouse. So I always go back to my top tool here. So whenever you've finished making a rectangle or typing something, always go back to your selection tool, so your very top left tool. You want to be on that the majority of the time. The majority of the time you're using the software, you should have that tool selected. So I've clicked and dragged, and you can see that's now selected everything that I've got here. I'm going to go to my layers panel. If you're not familiar with layers, layers are like sheets of paper. So when you put things one on top of the other, they hide what's underneath. So our artwork, our design, our things that we make is organised in layers. And it's in order of the things I put on there. So I put the shape on there first, then I drew that shape, and then I did the line last. And I've got little eye tools here, which means I can hide things, which makes it really easy to see. And you can see the one that's got the little blue square there is the one that's currently selected. So that's the one that I can easily grab and move around and do things to. If I wanted to select a different one, I can just click the circle and I can go, okay, that's that shape, that's that one. You can rename these, and that makes your life a lot easier. And I've just used this little triangle here to open up that layer, because layers in Illustrator are a bit like folders, so they have things contained in them. They're not just one thing. If I wanted to have multiple layers, so I could make a new layer, and then I'm actually just going to drag this one and put that on that layer. So now that is on the top. If I go to my properties panel and I just fill the square white, which it is, if I then drag this layer below, you'll see it goes behind everything. So when we're talking about ordering things, things being on top, things being behind, think of them like physical objects stacked on top of each other. So the layer that's on the bottom is the layer that's behind everything. The layer that's on the top is the layer that we see on top of everything. So I'm just going to select all of those and press delete on my keyboard. And I don't need that other layer, so I'm just going to stick with one layer for now. Now, quite often Illustrator will work with type. So when you use the type tool, always draw yourself a box. Don't just click and write, because you end up with endless lines of text that go on forever. So always draw yourself a text box to work in, because it gives you more control. You can turn it into columns. It gives you room to expand text, move things around. You'll see we've got some text in here already. Now, I didn't type that. This is called lorem ipsum, so it is placeholder text. So it's text that Illustrator fills in there for you before you then put your own text in there. And you can just replace it with whatever it is that you want to write instead. So I'm just going to give myself a capital letter to work with. Now, if I go to my properties panel now and I've got my text selected, you'll see it gives me text tools. So I've got all my fonts in here, which allow me to change the font of that text. And I've got my size. And you can just type directly in here. So I'm just going to go for 150. So I've got my text there. I've also got some things called appearance. So I've got fill and stroke. So fill is the fill colour. Stroke is the outline. So if I make that a bit thicker, so you can see, it adds an outline to my text. I can also have no fill. So this one with the red line means none. So no fill or no stroke. So that means I've now got a shape which has got a see-through part and just an outline. If I copy and paste that. Now, to copy and paste is Command C, Command V. You can do it the long way around and do copy and paste, but you can see it says there Command C, Command V. If I do the opposite and make that, and that, And again, using my layers panel to control what's on top, I can see which one I've got selected. I can select them both by doing that, or I can select them both by doing that. You'll see when I move this one over the top, the red shows through. So that shows us that this has got no fill. Another thing I can do, so I'm just going to make these both bigger. I have more control with text as well. So you can see I've got 3 little dots here, so this gives me more options. It gives me a bigger sort of, so if I wanted to make that letter really tall and thin, I could change the height. I could go the other way and make it really wide if I wanted it to feel really flat. If I'm typing lots of text, I can control things like the tracking here. So how far across the line does the text go? How long does it spread out? I can control the leading, so when it leads down the page, so the line spacing. So loads of different options in here as well that I can control. You'll also see I've got something called opacity. So my opacity is transparency, so how transparent or opaque something is. I do have more options with transparency, and I can open more windows here as well. So if I go to my window and I look in here, I've got things, my layers panel, I've got color panels, I've got brushes panels, all sorts. I'm going to go to my transparency panel, and you'll see this opens a little panel that gives me some more options, and I'm actually going to drag this, and when you see a blue line, it will pop it in there for me, and that makes it nice and easy. I've got some settings here which are called blend modes. So you'll see if I zoom in, so Command plus, when I select that top layer, so the object that's on top, and I change the blend mode, it changes the way it blends with whatever's behind it. So you can create some really interesting effects, you can create some really interesting sort of tones, shading, quite trippy effects here with those blend modes. So if you're ever looking at sort of opacity and wanting to play around with opacity as well, you can layer things together, you can layer shapes together. I could add a shape over the top of this. And again, I'm going to go to my fill, change the colour, go to my transparency, change the blend mode. Now part of this is just experimentation, so playing around, seeing what the different things do, exploring, getting used to it. So we've played around with text, we've changed the fonts. Another thing you can do with fonts, so if I go to my font panel here, I've got something called filters. Now if I open that, you'll see I've got options for sans serif, I've got serif, I've got slab, I've got script, black letter, and then I've got things like handwritten and decorative. So if I say that I want a script font, it will only give me script fonts, and then you can see all of the fonts that it gives me are script fonts. So when you're doing a design and you're choosing fonts, make sure you're being specific. Don't just choose fonts at random. Think about, do I want a sans serif font for this? Do I want it to feel modern and clean and crisp? Do I want a serif font for this? Do I want it to feel more traditional and more sophisticated? And think about the fonts you choose, and that filter there can help you. So that is shapes and text. We've looked at stroke, we've looked at fill, we've also looked at transparency, and we've looked a little bit at our layers panel. I'm going to talk to you a bit more about colours now. So colours in Illustrator are called swatches. Swatches is very much just a colour swatch if you think about going to B&Q and your paint swatches, all that kind of stuff. Now the options we have in here are very limited, so we've got some crude sort of primary colours and we've got some slight different tones, but it's not a very good variety. It's not the level of variety that we need as designers. You'll see I've got things here, I've got some little folders. These are extra folders of colour swatches that you can use. Now to get more of these, we go to this part. So this little, if I hover over there, it says swatches library. So when I go to my library and I go to scientific, you'll see different colour schemes. So you should be familiar with this terminology. So analogous colour schemes, complementary, split complementary, tetrad and triad. So I'm going to go analogous, and you'll see that brings up these sort of harmonious colours, so these colours that are next to each other on the colour wheel. So if I say I really like this sort of turquoise blue and purple colour scheme, I'm clicking the folder that's next to the colour scheme, and I'm going up to these 3 lines here, and I'm going to add that to swatches. When I go back into my fill here, you'll see that folder now lives in my swatches panel. So I can create a design quite easily that uses that colour scheme, and it's there in my swatches panel and it's easy to work with. Now obviously I've got my transparency on there, so I could select all of those and put them back to normal. So when you're working on a design, never just use the swatches that are available. Don't just use the basics that are in here. If you're feeling brave, you can start to edit those colours. So you can see I've gone into my sort of palette here, and it lets me control how much cyan, magenta, yellow or black is in those colours. But that is really for people that are a bit braver, that are a bit bolder, that are a bit more confident with making colours. And what you can do is, if I made a new colour, there's a little plus there, and I can add that into my swatches panel, and I can drag that into that group if I want to use that colour as well. So never just use your normal colours, always use a particular swatch or a colour palette using that little library. I tend to use Scientifics, it gives me particular colour schemes. The rest of the things that you need to know are to do with transforming things. So I've got a square here, I can move it around, I can make it shorter. If I want it to stay in proportion, I hold shift, so it will stay the same proportion, the same ratio, but it will get bigger. I've also got some little icons here which let me curve the edges of that, which you might want to do sometimes. And I can rotate it. So if I hover over this corner, you'll see my cursor changes from 2 pointy arrows to a curvy arrow, and that lets me rotate things. You cannot do the same with text. So if I type something in there, if I try to rotate that now, you'll see the text stays on a line and the box moves, which is not what we want. So if I want to rotate text, I want to put this on its side, I need to turn this into an object. So at the moment it's still editable text. I can still change the font and things. Once you've got a font you're happy with, I can still change the size and colour and things like that. But I want to rotate it, I want to have more control. I'm going to go to type up at the top, and I'm going to go to create outlines. Now you can see that flattens it, so I can't change the font of that anymore. When I select it, it doesn't even see that it's a font, so it doesn't give me font choices. But what I can do now is I can rotate it. I can also control each letter as well. So if I double click, you'll see it lets me select each letter. So I can make letters taller, I can make certain letters bigger, I could rotate them. So I can start to play around a little bit more with actually what I do to that letter form, to that font. If I'm being really specific, I can use this direct selection tool, so this second little selection tool. And when I click, you'll see it looks a bit different. So I've now got these anchor points. So if I just want to move the top two parts and I want to make that part taller, then I can. I can just select those anchor points, and you can see it starts to do some really funky things, but I've got a bit more control there. So if I just wanted to select those two anchor points and drag those so it's got a longer foot on it. So you can use your direct selection tool to edit that font as well. You can only edit that when you go to type, create outlines. Also, this is currently grouped. So if I go to my layers, you can see it's called a group, and if I open it, it gives me each individual letter. If I've got a design I'm happy with, so this is my combination, I'm going to select it all, object, group, and that organises this whole thing together. I should be able to scale it down if I then wanted to repeat it and play around with it and change it up and do some different versions as well. So we've looked at our generic selection tools, we've looked at some of the shape tools, we've looked at some of the text tools, we've explored our layers a little bit, and we've also looked at different options in the properties panel. Part of Illustrator is just getting to know it. If you don't know how to do something, Google it, YouTube it, there's tons of stuff out there. So if you're not quite sure how to make text bigger, or how to open a transparency window, or how to put text around a circle, etc., YouTube it, Google it, or ask me. So that's a basic introduction to Illustrator. We will do some more advanced stuff following from this.